Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to wait a few moments as we fill the room and really excited to start the webinar shortly. Wow, we've just hit 116 people. We've got a very full audience today, so I'll just wait another minute. Okay, let's get started, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is From Reporting to Real Action, What the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's 2025 to 2028 Plan Means for Business. And I am actually so excited to welcome Laura McManus from the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office, who is joining us today. I am just really grateful, Laura, that you have agreed to come and share the strategic plan with businesses. Laura is a leading business and human rights practitioner in Australia, specialising in the development and implementation of corporate human rights due diligence in global supply chains. And she joins us today as the Director of Strategy and Business Engagement in the Australian Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office. So there's no one better who could share this strategic plan with you. She began her career in the not-for-profit sector, working globally on issues of forced labour, peace building, and modern slavery, including co-authoring Tackling Modern Slavery in Supply Chains and the Global Slavery Index publications by the Walk Free Foundation. Most recently, Laura was the head of human rights at the Woolworths Group, the statement that we always share as best practice, where she led the group's response to the Australians Modern Slavery Act and the development of Woolworths Group's modern slavery statements. In 2023, Laura was awarded a Churchill Fellowship to examine best practices in responsible recruitment to reduce forced labour risks among migrant workers in Australia. And amongst her many other talents, she is a former director of the UN Global Compact Australia. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kim Randall. I am the co-founder and CEO of Fair Supply. Welcome, everyone. So, just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see a disclaimer on the slide. We are not providing legal or financial advice during this webinar. You can see the disclaimer on the screen, but without further ado, we will start. Okay. Laura, you're there. Okay, great. So this is what we have covered today. Who is the Anti-Slavery Commissioner? The strategic plan, but really what Laura and I want to do is engage you guys. We have 148 businesses on the line, all who are familiar with the strategic plan. And so we really want to spend the majority of this webinar today in a fireside chat. Please type your questions into the chat because we do have quite a lot of time to answer those questions as well. So, Laura, who is the Anti-Slavery Commissioner? I was going to do a big introduction and bio of Chris Evans, but he was appointed on the 7th of November 2024. So he's just completed his first year as Australia's first Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and it's a 5-year period. He has independent statutory office holder established under the Modern Slavery Act, and he provides national leadership advocates for victims and survivors, support, research and awareness, and drives accountability across businesses. He's accountable to Parliament. So are you able to expand further on that role and some of the work that you guys have done as an office over the past year?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kim. And before I kick in, I would just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the land I'm on today, which is the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Yes, as Kim mentioned, I was a bit of a late ring-in to the call. We were chatting the other day on a different topic, and Kim mentioned she pulled together a webinar on the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's strategy. And I thought, well, hey, I know a thing or two about that strategy. So if it works with my schedule, why don't I join? So thank you for having me at somewhat short notice. But that's also, I guess, my confession to say I don't have any slides prepared for today. But as Kim mentioned, we wanted to keep it. I can actually see there's a comment in there. There is one slide up at the moment that outlines Chris, but in terms of slides on the strategic plan, unfortunately, I don't have those prepared. But yeah, as Kim mentioned, we're just hoping to have a good discussion today. So yeah, starting with who Chris is, and then leading into a little bit about the strategic plan. So as Kim mentioned, Chris Evans, who's a former Labor senator for 20 years, since leaving Parliament, he then had spent some time at the Walk Free Foundation, which many of you will know is the organisation that produces the Global Slavery Index. And in that role, Chris was very active in the establishment of the first Modern Slavery Act and a bit of the work that went on around that. So I think we're pretty lucky as an anti-slavery movement to have Chris in the inaugural role, both understanding the policy and government side of things, so how to get stuff done, but also the modern slavery content as well. I would say, and if Chris was on the call, that the part of this puzzle that he knows least about is probably business, but we have spent quite a good amount of time in the first year spending time with business, from practitioners to C-suite boards and investors, really kind of getting him across the salient matters for business, which I'll go into quickly. So yeah, Chris's role, the creation of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, came about as part of the 3-year review of the Act. We're very pleased that the role of the Commissioner, alongside the creation of the very first Act in 2018, does have bipartisan support across the Parliament. And I think that's really important to know, that when I go to now talk about some of the functions of the role, that we know that both sides of Parliament have seen this as an important endeavour. So the Modern Slavery Act set out, in creating the role of the Commissioner, it also set out 15 functions that they wanted the Commissioner to look at. I am biased because I am the Director of Business Engagement at the office, but the first 3 functions definitely prioritise or focus on business, and that is to promote compliance to the Act, which is simply, if you need to report under the Act, you're reporting, support businesses to address their risks, and support sector-based and cross-sector collaboration, which I'll speak a little bit more about. I am conscious we might have some government colleagues on the line, so it's worth also noting within the functions that the Act does invite Chris and the office to consult and liaise both with Commonwealth, state and territory governments on different modern slavery matters, advocate to the government, and it's quite interesting that they have used the language around for continuous improvement in policy and practice, and that quite excites me, and also to provide advice to the Minister, caveat when requested. So very much the role was established to be an independent pillar to Australia's response, and we very much see that as one of coordination, leadership and advocacy, and I'll touch on some of the advocacy. Kim, assuming that's all right with you, I'll dive into a little bit about the strategic plan, and then
Yeah,
we'll crack on.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Laura.
Yeah, great. So I think you're all here actually to learn about how the newly minted strategic plan, we might be able to even throw the link in the chat, or we can
Yeah.
circulate it afterwards, how that applies to business. I guess a little bit of the method to the madness, when Chris came in office, and when most of the team came on board earlier this year, we really started a listening and learning phase with a whole host of stakeholders. Like I said, particularly important to centre Chris in front of business as well. So we had, I think, more than 250 or 300 individuals and organisations contribute either to the written consultation process, the online the online consultation or in person, and really importantly, it was co-designed with survivors and those with lived experience. So we had a lived experience advisor as part of the team to create the strategic plan, and Moe Turaga very kindly provided a forward to the plan as well. Along with Moe, Matilda, and other survivors, we were really thrilled that the Attorney General, Michelle Rowland, launched the plan, I think about 4 weeks ago now. And so I'll just take us through the 4 focus areas and give a few reflections on how I think they come to life for business. So the first pillar of the plan, and I should caveat that whilst the role, Chris's term as the commissioner is a 5-year term, as Kim mentioned up front, this is a 3-year plan. So the first pillar of that plan is to transform and promote systems that centre survivors and people with lived experience. And really the ambition is quite simple. It's to continue the work that we've started, but certainly centre survivors, elevating that so they should be more involved in policy design and importantly able to access the right support at the right time when they're coming out of situations. So some good work has started around Australia on this. I would like to commend the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner and his team, that they have also spent quite a bit of time building the infrastructure around survivor co-design and involvement and participation. But there's much more to be done, certainly at a government level. Now, from a business context, whilst we don't state this explicitly in the plan, what I do think is interesting is that those of you that might be familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, is this is quite akin to Principle 18, which is oft forgotten because many practitioners focus on Principle 17, rightfully so, which is about human rights due diligence. But that is actually supported by text in the principles that, recommend companies due diligence efforts is in fact informed by engagement with what the guiding principles called potentially impacted stakeholders. But that, does also mean the workers whose rights that many of us in our day-to-day seek to protect, but also those with lived experience. So I think it's just a good reminder that whilst from a policy setting, we're looking to centre lived experience and survivors, there is also opportunities for business to think about that in their own policy and systems design as well. The second pillar is around strengthening law and policy. And again, those familiar, I guess, a little bit more broadly with the space would know that our efforts here will really focus on the current conversation or the forthcoming consultation in particular around reform to the Modern Slavery Act. So when the Act came in 2018, it came in with a requirement for a 3-year review. That review's occurred, and the Parliament has responded the government at the time responded to that review. And there's a whole host of items that were agreed or agreed in principle or noted, and some of those items will go for further consultation. So certainly from the perspective of our office, one of those particular pieces we're interested in is a due diligence requirement being more concretely embedded in the Modern Slavery Act. Sometimes this is referred to mandatory due diligence or risk-based due diligence, and certainly we'll be taking and have taken a position that that is something that we support and will advocate for, but certainly in line with key international standards, namely being the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. Most of you will be familiar that both of those standards are actually already referenced and encouraged to be used in the government guidance on the Act. So we really see this as a shift from kind of the soft law of the guidance to a hard law requirement, and one that's important to help level the playing field and really pressure test those keywords that I mentioned around risk-based due diligence, putting that back at the centre of how companies think about doing this, kind of rather than the reporting and transparency regime of the current Act. So that's, I guess, the subtle differentiator. I do keep seeing the odd comment around slides. There are some slides that Kim has up that have the different pillars of the plan, but just shout out if you can't see those.
And we will be circulating the recording after to those who registered, along with the slides that are up on the screen.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kim. Happy to chat more about this in Q&A if it's of interest, but really for us, the key tenets to kind of close out this thinking on due diligence, it's around, again, what's embedded in those standards on identifying and addressing risk, taking action to address those risks, tracking those actions and testing their effectiveness. So I think as business, we have, we put in a lot of controls in place across a whole range of domains, be it quality, health and safety, other ESG matters, and we test if they're working. We've seen some of that in modern slavery due diligence or ethical sourcing programs, but I think there's some more work we can do around testing the effectiveness of, is all of this work we're doing having an impact, and then communicating how your risks are addressed. So that's in the second pillar of strengthening law and policy. I would note it's not the only policy focus of the office. The other piece that I think is of particular interest to business is we would like to do some work, particularly in Australia, around addressing vulnerable populations or populations at risks. And very quickly, we get to migrant worker cohorts and advocacy for a national labour hire licensing scheme. So if people are interested, I can talk more about that. But, currently we have different states and territories. Some have some form of licensing regime for labour hire providers, some don't. But we see that as an important gap to close in terms of either uplifting other states or having a national-based approach. The rubber really hits the road, you can see there in Pillar 3. So this is obviously the one where we will be very focused our efforts around business and government intervention, again, to really uplift capability for better due diligence. We really hear what we, hear you, and not only through the consultations, but in lots of the different conversations we've been having with business, that there is appetite for more tools and guidance. Some of you are probably thinking, oh gosh, not another tool and guidance, because at the same time, there is so much in the market already. So it's a little bit hard to reconcile. There's a lot in the market, but we're still hearing this demand. And what we think that boils down to is kind of tools and guidance that are, really practical, easy to use, speak to business, speak to procurement people, speak to folk in finance, speak to risk, and really strip it back of, maybe some of the theory and the why and the academic content, because it's important in a certain time and space. But, we're hearing this desire for much more applied tools. So we've got a few in train at the moment, particularly around risk assessment. What else have we got? Meaningful worker engagement, so to also capture the first pillar of the plan. And we're also doing some work, on migrant workers as well. So expect to see a few more of those come out. Well, in fact, the first tranche of specific business tools, some rolling out from the new year. We have already released one particularly on what is human rights due diligence as well, but that's a bit more of a brief, less of a tool. In this pillar, we also really want to keep the engagement up. So like I mentioned, we really are engaging practitioners, so kind of those of you doing the doing, but want to cross-cut across business as well. So finding the right opportunities to have meetings with C-suite, to meet with boards, either in board meetings or through director education via the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and also investors. So we're kind of really thinking about the different elements of business and where we might be able to add some value to those conversations. But then I guess the two other pieces in this stream that we'll focus on over the next 3 years is also, we heard loud and clear from business that, hey, we're doing all of this effort. The Commonwealth Government also needs to report under the Act, and, what's going on in public procurement. So that's why you can see in the title of this this pillar. It does talk about business and government, but I would actually also say it is a proxy to for any other reporting entity. So of course our focus is all reporting entities, which includes non-for-profits and other institutions such as universities. But suffice to note, we will start with some work around Commonwealth procurement, and then when we get the bandwidth, possibly towards the back end of the strategy, turn our mind to the states. I know that state-based procurement is also very important, and again, commend the New South Wales Commissioner for the work that they've started there. But I guess, like you all, are grappling with where we prioritise, and as a independent Commonwealth agency, we will prioritise starting with the Commonwealth. But the final piece of the puzzle around kind of our focus efforts on business in particular is to really create an enabling environment. That's something that came out again really clearly in the consultation, was, you know, either the how would you frame it? Kind of the risk of competition law, or the, you know, whether perceived or otherwise as a barrier to genuine pre-competitive collaboration that would actually really help companies either take a bit more action faster, or take some more meaningful action, or help understand their risks quicker. And we certainly do acknowledge that the ACCC released their sustainability guidance, I think also nearly this time last year, and it had a lot of, you know, quite good material, but particularly focused on the E in ESG, or they used, you know, a lot of environmental examples. There was a smattering of modern slavery focused case studies in that guidance. And so we've been in good discussion with them for the last couple of months around the opportunity to provide a little bit more guidance in terms of human rights or modern slavery style due diligence. Jury is still out on that, and we're still engaging, but we hope in time that we'll be able to share a bit more information to market that makes it easier for you guys to undertake the types of conversations and collaborations to help execute your due diligence a little faster. The final pillar of the plan is around improving access to justice and remedy. This work will very much focus on our engagement with government from a different perspective. You know, for example, if we look at criminal convictions or access to justice via a criminal justice lens, there's not a lot of convictions, particularly of forced labour in Australia. We've seen a handful more around domestic servitude or forced marriage. So really focusing on access to justice and remedy for those that are identified in situations in Australia will be the focus of one of my colleagues. Kim, maybe very briefly, I thought I would just touch on, I've mentioned, I suppose, the 3-year review and the consultation. It's very much, I should caveat that our office is not leading that process. That is a government process that will be run by the Attorney General's Department. Again, some of you might be familiar that they have started that process talking about Stream A consultations and Stream B. The Stream A, from a written perspective, has closed, and that was seeking views on changes to the Modern Slavery Act that may contemplate things like penalties, some of the wording around the criteria of the Act, and a few other kind of more administrative pieces. Broadly speaking, and it is a broad brush, that those were largely accepted by most stakeholders, business included. Of course, there's been no conclusion on that. That process is still underway, and we expect that the Stream B consultations, which will contemplate what this question of a due diligence obligation, like I've referred to, and also what they're calling matters of high risk declaration, that process has started, but in a more will pick up again in the new year. So I thought, in terms of where we're headed from that policy perspective, there are 2 matters that our office will participate in, but we're not leading. So I always have plenty more to say, Kim, but I might pause there.
This has been such a great overview of the strategic plan. And before we go to the fireside track, chat, we have got a question, and I'm really excited. Thank you, Kevin, for asking this question. How does the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's 2025 to 2028 plan intersect with broader ESG frameworks, and
Mm,
what practical approaches can businesses use to integrate modern slavery risk metrics into their existing ESG reporting and performance indicators? And so I might start by answering the
please.
second part of that question in terms of the practical approach. And really, like, I like to say that another word for due diligence is supplier engagement. So to undertake due diligence, you need to be building and deepening relationships with your suppliers to assess the risk and work with them to address the risk. And that's a universal principle across all ESG and a lot of other risk factors that procurement handle outside of ESG. And so, really, what we recommend is building those due diligence priorities into existing operational procurement processes, because it's very likely that your entire procurement team has great existing supplier relationships. If it's not great, it's probably going to be a deep one. They know a lot about your suppliers, and there is a relationship and process in which they have been engaging with them. And so, practically implementing due diligence, whether that's for modern slavery or climate or other ESG factors, should be built into that existing due diligence operational process that you have with your procurement teams. I could probably talk about this all day. I'll ask you, Laura, as to how that fits in, if at all, with this strategic plan, and then perhaps we can get into further discussion about all of these exciting issues. I feel like I now could talk for hours.
No, sure. And thanks, Kevin, for the question. I'll be brief. Look, I think in short and in a way, I mean, it doesn't contemplate the broader ESG universe. I'm learning very quickly in government, you kind of read your functions and you stick to your knitting in a way. I've heard Chris comment on multiple occasions that, he is the anti-slavery commissioner. It doesn't mean we operate in silos, but certainly in thinking of a document like the strategic plan, we really do need to contemplate it from an anti-slavery perspective. That said, we really do see opportunities and would like to operationalize, particularly in the case of business. We've started conversations around ESG reporting frameworks, for example. We're very interested in upskilling rapidly in climate reporting, but please don't ask me to comment on that. I'll have to defer to Kim because I'm not an expert in climate reporting. But look, I think there's opportunities, if not for streamlining, and I'm not certainly suggesting that, but opportunities for better integration and de-siloing, certainly within a government policy setting, but also within corporates around the different risk domains. And something that is on our mind in particular is around contemplations of the renewable energy transition, the concept of a just transition. It might not be the right framework to then talk about risk in the supply chain, but we know that is there. And so, how can companies, whilst also thinking about climate transition plans, which is really top of mind and existential, rightly so for some companies, but how do modern slavery considerations play in that? And I think it's not a direct answer to your question, but that is an example of how we would contemplate it.
It is, because these parts of the business in terms of risk reporting and performance indicators can't be siloed, because what happens if they're siloed is that the business unintentionally starts to make trade-offs. So if you're looking at a decarbonisation strategy and not considering human rights risk, then you are inevitably going to potentially elevate your human rights and modern slavery risks by not considering a just transition and these things together. The last thing I would say on that question in terms of integrating modern slavery risk metrics into existing ESG reporting, apart from double materiality, reporting in relation to climate, it's really important that what the modern slavery risk refers to is the risk to people. So it is a little bit different than other business reporting metrics where you are reporting to the business how these risks are a risk to the business. It's just very important to remember that when we're reporting modern slavery risks, we are obviously considering risk to the business, but the modern slavery risk is actually the risk to people. Okay, we could have a whole webinar on all of these questions, but before we move on, I'm really please keep the questions coming. Is there a plan to streamline the reporting for entities like state-owned corporations who are obliged to report against both the federal and state acts, Laura, or that my understanding is they'll need to continue reporting against both of those acts?
Yeah, certainly in the short term. It's not the first time that question has come up, and it's a really good one. Unfortunately, I don't have a great or fulsome answer to it yet either. But we do have the function under one of the functions under the Act, which is to engage with Commonwealth, state, and territories, as I mentioned, and so it's very much the domain where we could pick that up. But yeah, happy to take it offline further. But yeah, I guess no immediate plan in terms of you won't see it in the plan, but we do hear you. I guess that's then a policy piece setting where you would need to chat to both Commonwealth and, in this instance, I'm sure you're referring to the New South Wales. But yeah, the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act is very much focused in a I guess more heavily might be the wrong word, but it has more focus on public procurement in a way that the functions or the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act doesn't have. So that will be particularly true for the smattering of state-owned corporations.
And I know at Fair Supply, so we can move on to the fireside chat now. So due diligence is such a focus for businesses at the moment. Over the last 5-6 years, we have seen businesses who are doing this well go deep. So everyone started wide in terms of what does risk identification mean? Can we actually map our supply chains? What visibility do we have over our suppliers? Can we go beyond tier one to actually identifying where the real risk to people was, whether that was by industry, country, the many factors that are going into each individual company's risk matrix, and then how do we undertake appropriate due diligence to see what those companies who are operating in higher risk areas doing to mitigate those modern slavery risks. What does meaningful due diligence look like, Laura? What practical takeaways from, the term due diligence and all of the meanings that are associated with that? What does that look like?
Yeah, and perhaps cover it's probably a bit of a personal view and maybe less of an office view. I don't know if we've taken an official office view, but
No,
look,
absolutely
as a
noted.
former practitioner, or hopefully still a
Exactly. I
current
have so
practitioner
many questions
with
about
some
your
ideas. Look, I think
I
comes
didn't
down
want to
to
go too much into your profile at Woolworths, but I know on previous webinars I've claimed that it's the best modern slavery statement ever written. So I'm
oh
sure
my goodness.
everyone would appreciate your practitioner views on this.
Thanks, Kim. There's certainly some good reports out there. But that was probably it's in your question, what is meaningful, and I think meaningful is outcomes for people or those with whom the whole system is actually designed to assist. And I mean, it's very. I have also seen what you're seeing that a lot of time we've started by casting the net wide and people are getting narrower and deeper. But at the same time, kind of stepping into this role and reading a lot more statements than perhaps I had time for previously, you do see the diversity in approaches, and I suppose a bit of the cliff where you get out of top ASX, even 100, if I'm generous, calling it 200. But there's more than upwards of 2,500, nearly 3,000, I think, reporting entities annually. And if we think that even top ASX 2 or 300 have a good grasp on it, there's a long tail end and 2,000 odd other entities that are also reporting under the Act. Now, I'm not saying all of those entities aren't having a good approach. But I think what we've seen is uh, people getting tasked with this who this isn't their bread and butter. So I was very fortunate to come from a human rights background where I, understood the work, whereas you might have had, former people who look after compliance or risk or legal who kind of got thrust to the modern slavery work 5-6 years ago. And whilst we have seen upskilling, I think actually how I really want to answer this meaningful question is it's prioritizing resource where it can have the most impact. And unfortunately, we still do see a lot of entities casting the net wide, that the foundation of having a really good risk assessment and saying, and I guess even as a business saying, you know what, I'll pick an arbitrary number, 1,000 suppliers, we do think 700 are low risk, or we've engaged this platform and that's low risk. And it's okay not to do anything with those suppliers if you want. And if you don't have the resources, that actually, where is that most material salient risk to people? And I'm not saying the higher risk will be necessarily based on spend, as we know there's an intersection of factors, but using the limited resource you have to prioritize where you might get meaningful action, I think is, for me, how there's an opportunity for us to course correct a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's so important for companies to really validate their risk methodology, because depending on what sector in Australia you're operating in, what you may find is that your higher risk suppliers are actually not in Australia. Obviously, there are high risk industries in Australia that may not be the case, but in circumstances where you are undertaking due diligence, it is so important to understand what constitutes high risk so that you're not essentially misdirecting resources or due diligence resources on companies that, may have a modern slavery statement themselves or may disclose who their suppliers are. So really understanding where your company's risk focus is. I can't say how important that is. We have gotten a few questions as you have been sharing. In terms of labour hire, you'll like this one, Laura. In terms of labour hire licensing prosecutions under universal coverage schemes operating in Queensland and Victoria have tended to concentrate on high-risk vulnerable sectors. By comparison, the UK's GLAA scheme and South Australia's licensing scheme covers vulnerable high-risk sectors. What considerations inform the Commissioner's thoughts about whether a national labour hire licensing scheme in Australia should be a targeted scheme or a universal scheme?
Yeah, good technical
I
question.
know. I'm
Um,
like, you
I
need to feel free to share about your Churchill Fellowship. And I was like, maybe we've got 1 to 2 minutes for your answer.
No, I'll skip the Churchill Fellowship, but it's very relevant in a way because I went to the UK to look at how UK retailers are approaching risk in their supply chain to compare to Australia in a way. So it feels the GLAA, I understand where you're coming from. I think, though, suffice to note, we haven't, I guess, taken a position on should a national scheme, like the mechanics of that. I think we note, as I believe was noted in the question, that there's a varying maturity among the states that have a current scheme, and they're getting varying outcomes, noting, though, that Queensland and Victoria have some of the more robust arrangements at the moment in terms of the outcomes they're seeing. And so you are seeing the nefarious actors crossing the borders respectively into places like New South Wales, because there's less potential to operate in both Queensland and Victoria. But in creating either a harmonized national scheme or other states coming, I guess, online, if that's where we end up, we know where higher risk sectors are for labour hire licensing, or labour hire risk rather, and it does seem fit for purpose to me, just like it does for any corporate, that there should be a prioritised approach to that. Whether that means not everyone should be licensed or whether just enforcement should be prioritised, I guess that's up for contemplation. But you'd be, by the nature of the question, you'd be very familiar with the Fair Work Ombudsman. I believe they came out with a report the last few months around specific to horticulture, and I don't just want to focus on horticulture, but that report did, where again the non-compliance was far greater where labour hire providers were used in particular regions compared to direct hire. So we do know that manifests as a risk. And so I would assume that any form of certainly enforcement or priority action would look at the higher risk areas first.
Yeah. And I'm so glad the plan references the high risk sectors in it, such as energy, infrastructure, and construction. How's the office thinking about sector specific risks, Laura?
Yeah, it's a little bit kind of like the risk again. There's so many parallels actually between how a business would think about risk prioritization and how you nearly start to think about it from a policy or support perspective. But we are hearing a lot, and I think I didn't say the full question, but someone popped up about mining that there is desire, in the market that there are more sector specific, not only guidance to the risk, but how you go about doing the due diligence and the check-in. So to take some examples I'm all too familiar with, how you would respond to seafood, a risk in seafood is different to how you would respond actually to risk in cotton, which is different to renewable energy components, which is different to mining. The principles are the same, but actually, in a cotton supply chain, the types of documents you're looking to validate the origin is quite technical for cotton. And then, if you're getting a certification, how you log online and check the validation of the certification is very different to ensuring that an Indonesian worker on a long haul fishing trawler didn't pay a recruitment fee. So I guess there is an overarching principle here that actually we need to start getting more specific about the type of forced labour risk we're seeking to address. And once you get more specific, you realize that your interventions or your controls or how you do it also need to actually be sector or industry specific in some occasion and in those high risk areas. Now, of course, there's kind of a hygiene factor that will exist. But if we're really getting sector specific, I do think the control and the intervention needs to change. So I guess in terms of how the office is thinking about that, we're thinking about that in terms of the types of resources or material or conversations we can have. Now, I will caveat, we're a very small team and certainly the key takeaway is not a whole host of sector specific guidance is coming. But we would like to, I guess, get the right stakeholders in the room or start having those conversations to help, I guess, build that maturity in how people think about addressing specific risk.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more because if you look at, there's no universal modern, or there's so many unique modern slavery risk factors that are sector specific. So if you look at what's under the hood of Fair Supplies model, it's individual, country, and industry risk factors. And so interesting because if you're in the global agriculture industry, you're looking at very, very different things to a port. Like a port and just like the variance between the factors of exploitation and how those exploitation risk factors lead to modern slavery are just so different across industries. And so it's really important when you're undertaking your risk assessments to actually have a understanding of what the very real risk to that industry is, because what is a risk to industry A may not be a risk to industry B, and the same things don't always apply based on the industry and country that your suppliers are in. I'm going from my questions to the audience's questions, but I think it's really interesting in terms of obligations under the Modern Slavery Act, because we see this a lot at Fair Supply in terms of reporting entities who have been acquired by an overseas company as the majority shareholder. However, the Australian entities continue to operate as per normal in Australia. Does it impact the annual modern slavery lodgement and how. So, like, I'll first of all refer you to the requirements under the Modern Slavery Act as who the reporting entity is, because the first thing I would look at is who is the reporting entity and how does the acquisition actually affect who the reporting entity in Australia is. But I do think, like, the other way it should impact your modern slavery statement is the risk assessment, because if you've been acquired by an overseas company, it's very likely that your supply chain may change somewhat. And so understanding how it should impact your risk assessment and then how you address modern slavery risk is the first thing I would look at. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Laura?
No, I don't want to dodge the question, but I do. Yeah, it would get quite technical, and I think
Yeah,
specific to the context. So, yeah,
yeah.
there's other forms of way to access that advice, and certainly the AG's department would be able to assist.
Yeah, in terms of who the reporting entity is, but certainly if there is like any change in control to business, it inevitably changes the supply chain. So practically speaking, and this is not the legal answer, you should look at what the new supply chain is. So, the Commissioner's plan emphasises robust due diligence, but many businesses face challenges when engaging with suppliers in jurisdictions like China, where disclosure norms differ and information sharing is limited. What strategies or frameworks can companies adopt to meet modern slavery obligations while navigating these transparency barriers? So, I can start with how we do that at Fair Supply. Like the first thing is please engage with suppliers in jurisdictions outside of Australia in their local language. That would be the first practical advice that I could give. It is often we see a much higher engagement rate with the suppliers outside of Australia when we're engaging with them in local languages, and also taking into consideration local laws which change the questions that we ask. So in China, I can understand why you're not getting a high response rate if you're sending a standard, say, supplier self-assessment questionnaire, which requires them to identify risk mitigation factors specifically related to modern slavery in circumstances where the laws are such that that is not likely going to elicit a direct response. And so if you look again at those individual country and industry risk factors, there are quite nuanced questions that you can, where we have seen a much higher engagement rate and actually been able to build relationship with those suppliers because we've taken into both the language, the cultural context, the local laws, and the geopolitical factors when we've engaged with them. Laura, do you have anything to add to that?
I did, and as you were speaking, because I was actually just reading the question, then I lost what I was going to add. So just let me quickly double check the question. Oh, yes, I know what I want to say. Thank you, yeah, for the question. I think what I would add is, I guess, a little like what Kim said. This is, nearly jurisdictional agnostic, but it's also thinking about the right language for the context that, you know, sometimes modern slavery isn't at all a helpful framing. Indeed, it might not even be a legal concept in other jurisdictions. Maybe also forced labor isn't even helpful language. So it's kind of getting a bit more specific in supplier engagements as to what it might be that what type of information are you looking to gather, and can you talk about workforce characteristics, or payment of wages or overtime, and really kind of just focus in on what it is that might be some of the indicators to help you get a picture of risk with that certain supplier. But that's super relevant in a whole host of contexts.
Yeah, definitely. And I think most reporting entities have experienced engagement with SMEs. And as regulation expands, particularly with global frameworks like CSDDD, how should SMEs prepare? What has been the feedback the office has been receiving from small and medium enterprises?
Yeah, it also came out a lot in the consultation for the plan, and in a lot of the conversations that we have with business generally, there's probably three things that are top of mind for business. If I summarize unofficially, I don't have the data on this, but from my own memory, it's kind of the competition, collaboration concerns, need for more guidance, and impact on SMEs. And yeah, the SME thing, I kind of, I've never turned my mind to it, and I probably shouldn't confess that, but I started looking into the data, and I know there's a whole host of definitions from SME, so I also don't want to get embroiled in a debate on what's the definition of an SME. But I looked at the ABS data, and looking at SME as an entity with less than 20 headcount, so a small business is less than 20, a medium-sized business as less than 200 FTE equivalent, and then a larger business is anything more. Now, again, I know you can cut it by revenue, etc., but if we use that kind of just headcount as the basis, I think it was 97 point something percent of businesses in Australia are small businesses. That's not even medium businesses. So then medium businesses are roughly 2%, and then the remaining, 1.07% was large businesses. And it was, I guess, and enlightening, and I know I sound naive in saying all of this, for me, that actually, like, when we speak about impact on SMEs, that is the mass. So a little bit like kind of the common thread, I suppose, of my conversation today is breaking that down further or getting more prioritized. So I guess that what we've been hearing about SMEs is, I guess, duplication of effort, inefficiency in the system in terms of the types of information requests and the time it takes to complete those, but also a real appetite that they SMEs, and it's really hard to speak about them as a monolithic because I know how many of them exist now, but also want to do the right thing, and particularly if it comes to tendering for large work, that sometimes getting the large contract is also how they might stay afloat for the next year. So there's a lot of nuance when I actually think it was the BCA or the Australian Industry Group have used the language of kind of right-sizing regulation. And so I do think we need to think about it in this space. Of course, the reporting threshold under the Commonwealth Act is $100 million in annual turnover. But in order to execute the due diligence obligation, some of this is then has this cascading effect to SMEs. So, I think we also need to take a look at what we're doing as practitioners on as our approach. It might fit within our system, and it might be easy for our tender documents, and it might work well for us, but how can it work well for our suppliers? And there's some, larger entities are certainly grappling with this in some of the sector-based collaborations, or even just making decisions around accepting third-party information. So rather than having bespoke requests, they're accepting third-party requests in approach that's either called kind of harmonization or mutual recognition of different ways. So I think there's ways that we can go about it. It's certainly on mind for the Commissioner in our office around how what role we might play in actually just understanding the problem a bit more, and then helping provide some leadership towards what the solution is. But I certainly don't have the solution yet, but we know that it needs a bit of attention.
Yeah, and I think if you're a reporting entity who does send out supplier assessment questionnaires, take into consideration the size and sophistication of the organization you're sending it to when analyzing and assessing their response, because, and this is my personal view or my professional view, that you can't expect a small company or a medium-sized company to have the same resources to be addressing modern slavery in the exact same way that a large multinational organization is. And so the issue of sending the same questionnaire to different companies that have different sizes and different levels of sophistication is that when you are assessing their response, it may be that you're comparing apples and oranges, because a small business who is engaging with their suppliers appropriately, are very aware of the risks in their supply chain, but might not have the resources to be implementing sophisticated supplier codes of conduct. And that's not, they can't say that they're doing a lot of the things that large multinational organizations have been doing for years, makes it a little bit of an unequal playing field if you are a reporting entity that is assessing suppliers without taking into consideration their size and sophistication. So just for some practical advice, it may be worth looking at how you're engaging with your small and medium suppliers, and if you can take into consideration various factors so that they don't end up just appearing like they're not doing anything because they're not doing as much as large multinationals, would be my advice. We are almost at time, so we've gotten quite a lot of questions. So I think the last question is how will we be able to find out more about the new tools to be released by the office, and will these tools provide better access to government information that in relation to migrants and perpetrators to assist due diligence?
Yeah, okay. So the first part, how to become more aware. I probably should be organized with a sign up to our mailing list here or something, which I'm not. But I believe that you
We
can
can
find it on
circulate.
the
I'll
website.
circulate,
Thanks, Kim.
yeah, because I think
Um,
that's the wonderful thing about having you here, Laura, and it's really important for the audience to know that the office wants to engage with business. So, please sign up. I'll circulate the details of how they can sign up in my follow-up email. But I think it's great for everyone to know just how open and engaged you are with businesses.
Yeah, and we are, I mean, so we're still kind of building the plane as we fly, which should not give you not confidence in us, but that suffice to note, we're still establishing the right communication channels, etc. A colleague is working on our very first EDM, so these kind of direct to the emailing list newsletters, and as we start to build that infrastructure, something like that would be yeah, probably one of the best places. And in terms of the second part of the question around helping grapple with risk, I certainly hope so. So I think I'm able to say that I know we're short of time, Kim, but an entity called the Migrant Justice Institute runs surveys on migrant workers in Australia, and they've just completed last year, or I actually don't know the date, but they've recently completed a big survey, I think the largest survey ever of migrant workers in Australia. And for the first time, they looked at different forced labour indicators as part of that survey. They're due to release a whole host of information on that next year, and we are working with them to make some of that research insight available for business. So actually, much more specifically, it's actually like that was a Dorothy Dixer question, which it was not, but we are going to make, there will be a series of information, and this will not be immediate. So I guess from a time horizon perspective, it will be sometime next year available, that gets more specific on specific risk in the context of Australia, and that should certainly help, if not inform a risk assessment, then help inform the type of controls or actions companies take to mitigate risk, because we'll be able to get more specific as to how that risk is showing up. So yes, it's coming.
Great. Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, which is a shame because I could speak to you all day, but very grateful for the time that you have given the audience. Thank you, Laura. Fair Supply is always here to continue answering your questions. You'll see there's a QR code if you do have any other questions or want to book a short session with Fair Supply. So feel free to do that, and I will circulate the slides, recording, and all of the other information that can be provided from the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioners shortly following this webinar. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I have a very, very open door policy. I will put my email on the chat right now and would love to continue the conversation or schedule a meeting to continue answering questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.